Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to see you here. For those of you that I haven't met or seen before, I'm Melody Barnes. I'm the Executive Director of the Karsh Institute of Democracy, and I am thrilled that you're here with us on this rainy, dreary afternoon to engage in our next in the series of our Touchstones for Democracy speaker series. I know I've seen many of you here before, and we're always happy to have you in Bond House. And for those of you who haven't been here before, you know that this series is hosted by our John L. Now III Now Lab on the history and principles of democracy. And we do this in partnership with the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And our objective here is to engage in the research and the scholarship that focuses on the thinkers and the events and the principles and ideas that shape American democracy and democracy more broadly. So thank you again for being here. We had the idea last summer, I guess it was, I'm looking at some colleagues, that because this is the year of the semi-quincentennial, that we would focus our Touchstone series this year on the events shaping the American Revolutionary era. That this would be a wonderful opportunity for us to engage that scholarship and to think about the ways that not only the events that took place at that time, but also to pull that through and to think and reflect on the ways that those events shape our democracy and its promises, its opportunities, and its challenges today. So in keeping with that, I want to remind you that our next Touchstone series event will take place on March the 26th, and it will focus on the topic of home. And many of you may think, what does that mean? It's going to be a wonderful conversation between one of our fellows, Lauren Duvall, and Monticello's Jane Kaminsky, focusing on the role that women played during the American Revolutionary period and the British occupation of the home front and all that that meant to that particular period and political thought and culture at that time. And then after that, we'll have one more in the series. As we're all trying to shake off the effects of the snow and the ice, you may remember that we had to postpone one of our events, and that one is now going to take place on April the 23rd, and the theme for that event will be taxes. And the conversation will take us through the ideas and the themes that make the point that often a discussion of taxes are a discussion about American democracy and the nature of democracy itself. So then that, of course, brings us to today. And having had breakfast with the three people in front of you today, I can tell you that not only are you in for a treat, you're in for, and I think, an opportunity to learn a great deal about our theme of religion and religious freedom. We're going to focus on the questions that are central to the founding period and that remain central to American public life today. How have religious ideas informed democratic thought? How have religious communities shaped debates about liberty and inclusion? And how do those early arguments continue to influence our contemporary conversations about faith and public life? Guiding our conversation today is our colleague, our UVA colleague, Professor Nichole Flores from UVA's Department of Religious Studies. She is an associate professor of religious studies, as well as the director of the Catholic Studies Initiative, co-director of the Forum on Religion and Democracy, and director of the Health, Ethics, and Society program. Professor Flores is also a scholar of theology and religious ethics, and her work explores the intersections of race, migration, and Catholic social thought. And Nichole, we are very grateful that you are joining us here today and that you will moderate the conversation. So I'm about to turn everything over to Nichole, and she's going to introduce our speakers. But just two things, and for those of you who've been here before, you know one of the things I'm going to say. When this is over, don't forget to buy one of the books written by our authors before you leave. They will be on sale right outside the door. And the other thing I want to say is that if you enjoy this program and all of the programming that we do at the Karsh Institute, please visit our website and look for the Give button and consider giving to our Promise of Democracy Fund. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nichole. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction, Melody. It is my pleasure to moderate this event today with these two outstanding scholars who I will introduce to you now, Jerome Copulsky and Adam Jortner. Jerome Copulsky is a research fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. He co-directed Uncivil Religion, January 6, 2021, a digital resource created through a collaboration of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History and the University of Alabama's Department of Religious Studies. From 2016 to 2017, he was the American Academy of Religion and Luce Fellow and Senior Advisor at the U.S. Department of State Office of Religion and Global Affairs. Copulsky is the author of American Heretics, Religious Adversaries of Liberal Order. His writing has also appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, The National Interest, Christian Science Monitor, Washingtonian, and other fantastic outlets for this kind of public thinking. He earned a BA from Wesleyan University, an MFA from Columbia University, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. Adam Jortner is a professor of American history at Auburn University, currently a visiting scholar at Acadia Divinity School in Nova Scotia. He has published 4 books on the history of religion, miracles, and the American Revolution. His work has received multiple national awards from historical associations. He is also the author and performer of 4 Audible original series on the history of religion, witchcraft, and monsters. His performance in The Hidden History of the Boston Tea Party was a top 10 nonfiction download on Audible in January 2024. In 2024, Adam was chosen by The Great Courses to design and deliver a streaming video series for the America's 250th anniversary entitled 1776, Years That Mattered. It will debut this spring and cover the history of the world in 1776. Adam previously worked as a freelance writer and a member of the script team for the PBS show Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego. It is a real pleasure to have you both here with us, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So I wanted to begin at the beginning and to give you each an opportunity to say a few words about your book projects for those of us who have not yet had the opportunity to read them. But I wanted to add a twist to these introductions with the following questions. What are the origin stories of your books? In other words, what animated your decisions to pursue research on these really fascinating and I think crucial topics? And you can, rock, paper, scissors for who goes first.
I'll go first. No. The real story is not that impressive, Nichole. We were waiting for my second child to be born, and I needed something to do to occupy my brain other than worry about that. I started work on some early instances of anti-Semitism in the 1820s and 1830s, and I figured, I need to go back and take a deeper look at sort of Jews and religious freedom in the Revolution. And what I discovered was there were a lot of Jews in the American Revolution, that they play an active role in the conflict, that they become officers in the Revolutionary Army, that they petition for their own rights, and they're fully integrated into the Patriot movement by 1783. And this is a story that nobody really knows, that we have this idea, and we have this idea from a lot of sources. We have the idea, the Patriots were basically boring. They were all kind of the same, and they probably all went to church, and it was definitely a church where you sit down and you are quiet for a long time, because that's what it was like back then. The religious diversity of the founding moment was something that absolutely captivated me, and that just sort of kept driving me on.
Well, that really comes through your book, that's for sure.
So, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Nichole, and thank you, Melody. And it's a real pleasure and a thrill to be at Mr. Jefferson's University to talk about questions that were dear to Mr. Jefferson's heart. and mind. So I want to begin with that. And I think the origin of the book actually comes with my confusion in 2017 with the turn of the events of the 2016 election and the coming to be of the first Trump administration. And particularly the way in which there was a mood among some religious intellectuals and thought leaders that seemed to question the idea of America as a Christian nation. And I think of two books in particular that came out about this time. One was Rod Dreher's The Benedict Option. Rod Dreher is a writer and editor. He was at the American Conservative at the time. And the other was Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. And both of these books argued that what they saw as the malaise of our current period, which had led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016, could be traced back to essentially the Enlightenment and liberalism and a founding that they saw as being animated by liberal Enlightenment ideals. And in this, they were different from the kind of more classical Christian nationalist story, Christian right story, where the founding was a Christian event, right? Where the founding fathers, pious Christians of the sort that they had set in place, if not de jure, at least de facto, a Christian republic. And it really wasn't only until the post-World War II period that this doctrine of secularism and the separation of church and state came to prominence, and that led to the decline in the second part of the 20th century. So Deneen and Dreher and others like him, offering a different story of America, which I thought was interesting. And what I tried to do in this book was essentially sort of excavate earlier instances of this religious or theological challenge to the American founding, going back to the loyalist theologians of the Church of England, and then working my way up to post-liberals like Deneen, national conservatives like Jerome Copulsky and the like. So that's really the supervillain origin story of this book, and we can get into the nitty-gritty details as we progress.
Yes, those are both really helpful the villain origin stories here. I would say the hero origin stories, because these are excellent books. I really enjoyed reading them. And both of your works help us, they're very different works from one another, but they really overlap in that they help us to develop a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between church and state at the time of the founding. Even though as we've discussed earlier, your chapters really take us into the present moment, but they both help us to think about the founding and religious liberty in a new way. Adam, your work offers a vivid picture of how Jewish patriots employed the separation to contend for religious freedom, for, as you say, for creating a new rights of religious freedom that hadn't existed before, but also to contend for a richer conception of citizenship. These were really organized patriots, and they were Jewish. Jerome, your work demonstrates how the separation between church and state, as you already shared with us, was contested from the time of conception, from the founding time until this very day. So the question that arose for me as I was reading your works was, how might they be instructive for current discourses and really current controversies about the relationship between separation of church and state that we're seeing unfold in real time in our own national discourse at this time?
I think mine is pretty simple, which is to say, the argument is often made that America is founded as a Christian nation. There is very little evidence to that end, but it is simply stated based on the idea that because back then everyone was Christian, which has a whole bunch of interesting suppositions baked into it, whether you're secular, whether you're a Christian. It's the idea that, oh yeah, back then everybody was Christian. And then obviously in modern days, we've started to lose that. And I'll try not to be too irritated, but church attendance is highest in the 1950s. which means it was low in the 1920s. But I'll get back to that. But we have this idea. It's a time. The revolution is a time period where much of what we hear about religion and the revolution is either cherry-picked or invented entirely, or based on the supposition that, like, because the founding fathers went to church, therefore it was a Christian nation. And it doesn't really get into the question of who was there, and it doesn't really get into the much cooler question of, could you be a Christian and still be in favor of separation of church and state? Is there a way in which forms of Christianity or whole enchilada relies on the state being separate from the churches? And the Jews were a great example of that, because, of course, they were a non-Christian religion. Most of them were white. So these are white guys who are just taken into the army. And there's an extent to which even the very act of breaking from Great Britain, when the Patriots step away, they are automatically breaking the British state churches. They are removing themselves from the protection of the king. And there are lots of times where a guy named Mordecai Sheftall becomes a Patriot leader in Savannah, in sort of de facto leader of Savannah after they overthrow the British governor. He wouldn't have been able to hold that under the crown because he's Jewish. He can't take an oath on the New Testament. Similarly, there are a couple of guys elected from Maryland to be in the Constitutional Convention who couldn't be elected under the British because they weren't Protestant. So this is a way in which that break happens, and the Patriots embrace it, and Jews and others, Baptists, Catholics in particular, take advantage of that and begin very much pushing for, this is going to be a republic where your citizenship is not based on your confession. And I think that's a really important thing for us to say. If we really take apart and really want to look at things, do we want a Christian nation? Do we want the church and the government to work together? We have to, normally that's passed over as, well, that will just be because things will be better that way. Things will be more moral. We have to ask the real questions. Is this what the founders did? And what are the real ramifications of saying your citizenship is in part based on what you think in here and up here about there?
Yes.
Yeah, so, if we go back to the Revolutionary era, there were a lot of Christians, but Christians were on all sides of the controversy regarding the colony's relationship to Great Britain. Surely there were many Christians who supported the breaking away and independency, but some of the loudest voices for the crown were Church of England clergymen throughout the colonies, but mostly actually in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And their argument, I think it's important to remember that at the time of the American Revolution, there were various church establishments within the colonies. There wasn't a church establishment. In New England, there was a kind of the old Congregationalist order that was the established church, the established religion. In the southern colonies in Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, and the Carolinas, it was the Church of England that was the established church. In the middle colonies, it was kind of a bit of a free-for-all. Rhode Island's a whole other question. So from the point of view of, say, Samuel Seabury, who some of you may know because you are Episcopalians or you've seen the Broadway show Hamilton. He gets it wrong, by the way. But according to Samuel Seabury, who is a Church of England clergyman in Westchester, New York, one of the reasons for the Patriot attack on the empire was the failure of Great Britain to actually establish the Church of England throughout the colonies. In other words, it wasn't church establishments that were necessarily the issue. It's what church is being established. And particularly the Church of England, which was a establishment of the monarchy, the Church of England, and the empires, which was not the case in New England. So when we look at sermons, particularly sermons that are opposing the American Revolution from, say, 1774 through the war itself, the argument is that the Patriots were bad Christians. They they believed in the God of liberty rather than the God of order. They did not accept their duties as subjects to the king as described in various New Testament texts, right? So even there was since a kind of a disestablishment spirit to the revolution itself, insofar as the revolution involved breaking away not only from Great Britain, but from that establishment between the Church of England and government.
Mm-hmm. Well, in that, and feel free to respond to this as well, Adam, that point that you make about this distinction between the Church of Liberty and the Church of Order, that continues to figure into some of these debates that you were highlighting in your previous response about the appropriate relationship between church and state today. That one of the things that is really helpful and important about your book is that it shows the DNA of claims that there is a proper ordering of church and state, and we got it wrong, right? I think that is really important. I suppose the question I have then is how is that playing out in the founding period in ways that are both related to and distinctive from what we're seeing now?
Yeah, so when the Constitution is being drafted and being discussed, one of the innovations that came out of Philadelphia was there was no acknowledgement of God or religion in the federal Constitution. Right? If you go to the Declaration of Independence, there are three vague references to the deity or the providence. None of that's in the Constitution. There's also Article 6, Section 3, which forbids a religious test for federal office. And then later, the First Amendment, which disallows the establishment of religion, whatever that means, or any action that would infringe upon the free exercise thereof, whatever that means. Right? So this was actually a new thing in political history, correct? And this was seen by a number of religious leaders as creating a infidel republic. So one of the traditions that I look at in the book is a very small fringe group of Presbyterians known as the Reformed Presbyterians or the Covenanters. And they looked at those things like I mentioned, right? No acknowledgement of God or Jesus or the Bible, right? No religious test for office, which means that not only can a non-Protestant become a Jew, a Muslim, an infidel could become president. Thomas Jefferson could become president, right? Did become president. And by not establishing a church, the state is not doing its duty to protect the true church, and it's licensing infidelity, right? So this group, the Covenanters, essentially said no thanks, and they became conscientious objectors to the country. They said, we're not going to stand for office, we're not going to vote, we're not going to serve on juries, we're not going to be in the militia, we'll pay our taxes because we don't really have a choice. We won't participate politically until such a time as the nation comes to its senses and fixes these problems and makes the United States a truly Christian republic, right? And, later on in American history, they began to advocate for a Christian amendment to do just that. And I think if you look at certain corners of American Christianity today, you will hear people who are essentially speaking in a similar voice, that what America needs is not just a return to some, pre-1950s settlement of church and state, but needs to explicitly affirm itself as a Christian nation constitution.
Yeah, and really laying claim to that tradition in important ways. Any thoughts about that, Adam?
I know. Yeah, I want to just sort of. The alternative is something that's worth thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
The alternative is the Great Chain of Being, which, for those of you who don't know, is a theory to start. God is at the top, and God makes the king, and then under the king, God makes the nobles, and then so on and so forth down to peasants and
Yeah, farmer in the dale,
What?
right? The farmer in the dale.
Yes, farmer in the dale. Right. Right.
The mouse takes the cheese.
Mouse takes the cheese.
Yeah.
Which is the way these guys like Seabury are thinking of it. And we should take that seriously, which is not only to say that God makes the political order, but God orders everything. God puts everyone in their position, and therefore the world as you find it cannot be changed, should not be changed. You anger God if you do things like suggest that social classes should mix, or that the people below can speak to their betters, that sort of thing. And there is that case for order. The case of the revolutionary Jews, and I would argue with many of the Patriots, is that no, what we have here, we have broken that. The king, Thomas Paine, in America, the law is king. We're all supposed to be members of this same governmental machine, and we will all participate equally to make decisions, which means that you can push for, I mean, from a philosophical point of view, and I know well who I'm talking to here, so give me some rope. From a philosophical point, means that change is much more possible. I'll stop there.
Well, and I mean, I want to hear more, and especially, I think all of my, neurons start firing as someone interested in religion and political philosophy, and Thomas Aquinas, when you talk about this chain of being and order, especially because and we talked about this at breakfast, one of the things that most excited me about your book as a scholar, and myself a scholar of religion in the Southwestern United States, specifically Latino religions, is the way that you were able to illustrate the relationship and tease out the relationship between race and religious liberty at the time of the founding. And I actually think that your work has really important gestures to this as well. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how that plays out in your work and how that is related to this challenge of order and really that tension between order and liberty that we're teasing out here.
Yeah. So to go back to Mordecai Sheftall in Georgia. Georgia is a great example. So Mordecai Sheftall is one of the leaders of the revolution in Savannah. He leads various parochial, they were called the parochial committees. Jew was in charge of it. He later goes on to serve as quartermaster for the army, so on and so forth. When William Blair, the governor of the governor of Georgia, comes back, I'm getting his name wrong, but that doesn't matter. Because I remember what he said, which is one of the first things he does when he gets to Savannah is he says, no more, he bans Jews. Jews can't come in here. Why? These people to a man have been opposers to our work. And earlier, before he got captured by the Patriots, he wrote, you would not believe who was in charge, who was doing this. There's a blacksmith, there's a Jew. And I, as a scholar, sort of glommed onto that. Isn't that interesting that he sort of says lower orders and Jews are sort of coming to take over. Yeah. Those who don't know how to do it are going to take over and start running the show. Who knows what would happen? Maybe the American Revolution. Sorry, I digress. The point being, so the point is, in Europe, there's a fairly clear racial distinction between white Christian Europeans and white Jews. Through the course of the revolution, I think that distinction begins to erode. And there's, those of you who do Judaic, we're familiar with Judaic studies, there's a whole cottage industry about sort of how do Jews become white. And it's really interesting. I don't have time to, I mean, hey, listen, it's when I teach this stuff, when I teach this stuff, I have a great moment when I say, race is invented. And my spouse is like, no, what are you talking about? I mean, look, I'm a white guy. I'm a super white guy. But 60, 70 years ago in Central Europe, I'm not a white guy. Jewish. And then that usually, because I teach in Alabama, they're like, wow, that's amazing. Don't know if this is going to work outside of the Deep South, but it really, really plays in Alabama. But in this way, it is part, religious freedom is something that obviously, for the most part, applies to white guys, not exclusively. I really can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah.
But that there is sort of this dynamic of, okay, freedom, at least in as it constructed in the 1780s, is going to apply to white guys. And again, but it also sort of sets up this dynamic where, but if God is God of the whole state here, and if there are no divisions in God's kingdom, which is something that's a lot easier to say when you're not under an Anglican system. No offense, Anglicans. Interesting. Shouldn't we also have rights? Isn't there something wrong about me exercising my power over another person arbitrarily that shouldn't be in this? I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, yeah. Any thoughts on that, Jerome?
Well, I think, to go back to this understanding of, this tensions between order and liberty, and an order involving hierarchies, right? Hierarchies of being, but also those hierarchies are of rank and station in this world. So not only sort of nobles to commoners, but men and women, free whites over enslaved blacks, and so on and so forth. And so if you have a religious system that is then saying, we have these created that are kind of metaphysically grounded hierarchies, which is what Seabury and the Anglican loyalists were saying. But it's also what the Southern Presbyterians were saying in the pre-Civil War period, right? Therefore, this very idea of democracy, this very idea that all people can be citizens and all have the same rights and responsibilities under the law, is an affront to the created order, right? And so that, that's kind of like the deeper, theological, political question. And this doesn't break Christian versus non-Christian, because of Christians who have this very strong sense of order and providence and hierarchy. And then there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither free man nor slave, right? So within the traditions themselves, there are tensions about what is order, what is liberty, what is providence.
Yeah, that is actually really helpful transition to possibly the final question that we'll address before we open up for Q&A from our distinguished audience members. But these tensions within traditions, and actually some of this really comes out in exciting ways in your text when you discuss the developments of a Jewish political, the kind of the political philosophy, political theology of Jewish patriots that seems to kind of coalesce around an identity of citizens, and not so much the distinctions theologically that were within the community. I'm thinking specifically of the folks who gathered at Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. So there's this real. Do you want to make?
Yeah, no, I'm going to jump in.
Yeah,
that's right. This is the craziest story.
Yeah,
and it's true. So during the course of the Revolution, every major American city with a synagogue is conquered by the British by 1780, except Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the only city that has a synagogue. So patriot Jews who don't want to live under the crown and who have the means go to Philadelphia, and they reform the synagogue there. Mikveh Israel is refounded by a deliberately national board. They pick a guy from New York to be the leader of services. They pick a guy from Philly to be the head of the board. And they're trying deliberately to make this national Jewish organization. And then, of course, they invite everybody to come. And then, of course, what follows, it's, when you gather all of these young, eligible men and women, like at a Jewish summer camp, there's lots of romances. Well, shout out to Camp Seneca Lake. And that creates in American Judaism a kind of national organization, which means that one of them, I can't swear that it was the very first, because the Baptists may have done one that I didn't hear about. There were a lot of them. The very first national religious organization in the United States is Jewish. It's not Christian, it's not Catholic, it's not Protestant, Presbyterian. It's Jewish. And that tells us something about just how far this structure that gets created can be stretched, and how far the system will stretch.
Yeah.
And one thing I just want to mention, there are different. I mean, of course, if you've ever been in a Jewish community, you might know that sometimes they have arguments with each other.
Every now and then.
This also happens at Mikveh Israel. There's a guy named Gershom Seixas, who's the Chazan, who leads the Jews out of New York just before it's conquered by the British, and he brings the Torah with him into Connecticut. And he has one position, and there's a guy named Jonas Phillips, who's also a very strong patriot, huge Alta Kaka, was the president of the congregation, loses the election, then refuses to hand over the deeds to the synagogue. This is going on for years, but Seixas and Phillips are collaborating with other Jews on they go through every constitution of every state that then existed. They go through the Declaration, they go through Articles of Confederation, noting the religious freedoms in each document. And then they use that to write a letter to the branch of the Pennsylvania government, which is in charge of amending the Constitution, saying, let's get rid of the test oath. Let's get rid of the law that says you have to take an oath to support the New Testament to hold public office. Which means that even though these Jews this is not quite what you were talking about, but these Jews are having theological, religious conflicts, and a political ideology from patriotism allows them to work together.
Yeah.
At least for a time, because they are pressing for these political changes that they can agree on, and it allows them to live together without having to separate out.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ways that I think we often miss when we talk about how theology. There's an idea that obviously we start with theology, and that leads to politics. That is actually not true. It can happen, but it's just as true that politics can filter down, and then suddenly you're finding theological claims for something.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful too. And Jerome, maybe as a final comment before Q&A, and I'm kind of building on what Adam was just sharing with us, what sort of lessons might religious communities, of course I have in mind Catholic religious communities, but you don't have to cater to the moderator here, but who are trying to grapple with the challenges of the current moment about their own relationship to democracy. I think specifically within Catholic and Christian communities where I spend my time, there's been a lot of statement writing about, the relationship between, whichever religious institution and democracy. And that's been going on for a while, but it's really, ramped up over the past few years. What sort of, if not lessons, information or advice might communities, I see at least one priest in the room among us, but people who are trying to navigate this terrain, what might they take from what you've written in American Heretics for us?
Yeah, so I'm not gonna share an age or summer camp. Not yet.
Not yet. There's a dinner.
But I think the answer to this question, I actually want to follow up on Adam's work. So I mentioned these Reformed Presbyterians and their quest for a Christian amendment in the 19th century. And they keep trying, and they're big. They have a big push in the 1950s. And in 1954, they actually get a Senate hearing for their Christian amendment in May of 1954. And it's around the time that the legislation for the revised text of the Pledge of Allegiance is going through Congress, right? So to add under God. So this is happening at kind of a high point of this American civil religion push during the Cold War. And they have this hearing. Only one senator bothers to show up. It's not really well attended, but the Covenanters show up, and they make their case for why America needs a Christian amendment and why they need it now. And they need it for the same reason that Congress decided under God was needed to be put into the Pledge of Allegiance to fight the godless commies. The witnesses who came to testify against the religious amendment were from the ADL and the AJC, the American Jewish Union. And they actually were involved in litigating some of the major church-state cases in the Supreme Court around that time. And the Covenanters are getting up there and they're making their case about why America's really a Christian nation. De facto, we should make it de jure. That they bring in, sermons by Billy Graham. They bring in statements by, Justice Joseph Story. They present their case. And the Jewish witnesses essentially make their case too. And who do they appeal to? They appeal to George Washington. They appeal to James Madison. They appeal to Thomas Jefferson. They appeal to the founding. They appeal to the Constitution. They appeal to the letter at Newport. They appeal to Jefferson's statement on the wall of separation of church and state. In other words, what I think that they're doing is they're actually appealing to the American tradition to preserve the American tradition in the name of not only their freedom, their religious freedom, but in the name of the religious freedom of the whole. And I think that going back, and it's an interesting. We can actually have the transcript of the hearing. There's another group that shows up to testify for a religious amendment, and these are a number of concerned patriotic women from Southern California. And they argue that the reason for a Christian amendment, the reason why America needs a Christian amendment in 1954, is to protect Christian America from the Jews and from the Judeo-Christian project, which is about undermining true Christianity. If you go and you look at some of the discourse coming from the far right today, you will hear echoes of that testimony. And so I think it's worth our while to go and revisit some of these historical moments, and it's worth our while to understand the positions and the arguments of all sides.
And I just want to riff on that for one. 1954 is a really important year in American religious history. I also want to say it is normally the year that people think of when they say, well, back in the day. Back in the day usually means 1954. Probably because of Back to the Future, but maybe not. Note that in Back to the Future, everything in the 1950s is brand new.
Yeah.
But I digress. 1954 is really important. But there's often it is talked about, I think, on social media as though like, well, the Christians who want to go back to the past just want to go back to 1954. But there's a Christian evangelical argument to be made there, which is to say, what about those who were Christians before 1954, when they weren't in positions of power, when they weren't on the vanguard? They had to live in America as well. And so this is something that we can, I think, engage all kinds of people with, which is to say, okay, well, why 1954? Is Christianity supposed to be in positions of power and authority? And is that, why is that? And it's worth pointing out in a non-judgmental way.
Oh, absolutely. Well, let's open up the floor, continue the conversation. And I think we have a mic coming around. So yes, I saw a hand right up here. And yes.
I'd love a quick evaluation of where Mr. Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state stands today.
Well, have at it, guys.
Okay. The wall of church, if Jefferson created the wall of separation of church and state in a letter to the Danbury Baptists, who had made him a gigantic cheese and brought it to the White House, and that's where he discusses the nature of having a wall of separation. The idea being that the Danbury Baptists didn't live. Connecticut still had a state church, and the Danbury Baptists didn't live in a place where there was a wall of separation. I think there has been some retreat on this. I mean, we can go into details if we want. There has been some retreat on this over the last couple of years, loss of the Lemon test most prominently. I do think the discussion of church and state as it's being held right now is missing the point. It is being argued primarily as, well, Christians should be allowed to have this in the public sphere versus what about religious minorities? Whereas for Jefferson was talking about religious minorities, but it was the Baptists, which is to say he was talking about a Christian group who didn't want the state deciding how they should pray, because ultimately I think that's what the real issue is. when the state engages in religious activities, you are subcontracting your relationship to the Lord God Almighty, to the state, and they are making the decisions for you. And as Baptist great John Leland said, if government can stand in for man on the day of judgment, let them have control in religious matters. If not, let men be free. It's not a question of the rights of religious minorities. It's not the question of the rights of atheists. It's the rights of everybody, even majoritarian Christians, even evangelical Christians.
Jerome?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long, complicated question. And I would say that when we think of the separation of church and state today, we're really thinking about things that were put into place in the late 1940s and 1950s. We're looking at the Supreme Court, the first major Supreme Court decisions, explicitly using that language, reaching back to Jefferson. Everson's probably the first one in 47. And what we've seen is definitely retreat from this very strong legal secularism that was put into place in the post-Cold War period. I think what's going on now is there's definitely a interest on the current administration of pushing the boundaries. And Exhibit A, I think, for those of you who pay attention, is in the Department of Defense and the way in which Secretary Hegseth is bringing in not only religious leaders to provide, prayer services or instruction, but pretty explicit Christian nationalist leaders like Doug Wolfson in Moscow, Idaho. And that's, I think, they're doing that explicitly to make a point. But I think the retreat from the legal secularism is something that goes back probably to, the 80s and 90s. So the separation, the idea of the separation of church and state is itself a complicated metaphor because the Covenanters, who I mentioned earlier, the Reformed Presbyterians, were all about the separation of church and state, as the church and state are two separate institutions. What they believed, though, is that those institutions had responsibilities to one another. So they didn't believe that there should be a theocracy or even necessarily a state church, but they believed that the state should be supporting certain kinds of religion and religion should be supporting certain kinds of politics.
So many questions now. Let's start from over here, and then we'll make our way this way.
Brown versus Board of Education was a unanimous 9-0 Supreme Court decision in 1954 also, outlawing segregation in public schools and overturning Plessy versus Ferguson, saying that separate but equal is inherently unequal. Also, you've got the whole underlying foundational principle of America, which is universal equality. And you've got the religious orders saying, no, we have hierarchy everywhere, kind of like bureaucratic institutions today. So I just wonder how the rest of the tenor, when you start to integrate the political ideas of the time, the economic ideas of the time, the social ideas of the time, the non-religious ideas, interplay with religion, and whether you think the Brown versus Board of Education holding had religious overtones.
If I was a coward, sir, I would say that's not my period. I'm not a coward. I think you hit on a really good point that everyone who cares about this and who talks about it in the public sphere and with sons and family should remember, which is to say, the idea that every person who worked under a state church or had a deep religious feeling was a bad person and did bad things. That is false. That I won't even bother trying to disprove it. Mm-hmm. I think the question is, and I wouldn't go back to 1950. I mean, you could if you wanted to. I'd go back to Sia Ricout, devoted evangelical, did not believe in the morality of homosexuality, did not believe in gay rights, when AIDS breaks out among the male gay community primarily, he has a religious decision to make and decides that he needs to try and save as many lives as he can. So it's not that people who have it's the idea they hit on this. This is not about demonizations of peoples, but it is about sort of like what's the principle? How do we live our lives as free people religiously if we are answerable to God alone? And the effort to sort of make it about, well, state churches were bad because they did these bad things. No, they were good because they did these good things. Is kind of maybe will never ultimately be answered, which is why I think Jefferson, in his public statements, puts the emphasis on what does the greatest good for our freedom, and is to have each person be answerable in make their own choices about the religion that they're going to choose to follow.
Yep. Thank you. There was a couple over here. The gentleman in the white shirt. Yes.
Yeah, so this came up a little earlier, like with regards to Thomas Jefferson. Obviously, there was a lot of kind of partisan mudslinging over religion, between Federalists and Republicans back in like the turn of the 18th century. Did these kind of debates ever include debates over like the status of Jewish Americans in America? I mean, was there like a particular like faction that the Jewish Americans aligned themselves with? And like, were Jewish Americans considered like kind of like a political like target group at this point, or
one thing I found that was really okay. So if you take nothing else away, you can take this. There is there's some political anti-Semitism during the founding, and it is sort of easily defeated. It's in the 1820s and 1830s that sort of an organized political anti-Semitism begins to drift into American public discourse. Not surprisingly, this is also the time when organized anti-Catholicism starts coming into American discourse. There's a guy, John Thayer, is a Protestant minister who goes to Rome in 1790 to disprove, there's all these miracles at Rome, I'll disprove them. He doesn't disprove them. Instead, he's like, they're real. I better become a priest. Becomes a priest. Moves back to Massachusetts in 1790, that's when they were still having Pope's Day celebrations where they burned an effigy of the Pope. And Thayer and Protestants have public debates over Catholicism. 1830s, that begins to shift and change, and then anti-Catholicism becomes a motive force in American politics for 100 years. The point is, this idea that I've heard far too many times that, you see, the way it works in history, here's time and here's goodness, and the history goes like this. And it's like, people, I can't believe, I thought we had gotten past anti-Semitism. Well, did you? Okay. It goes like this. And I don't mean to be flippant about it, but we should be honest with ourselves that it's not, people don't start off as, they really hate everybody, and then over time, as we legalize marijuana, everybody chills out. That's not what happens. People are affected by the tenor of their times, by the tenor of the discourse, by what they read. And that's an important, and so the lesson here is for those of us who are interested in fighting religious discrimination of all kinds, you can't just point out, it's 2026, shouldn't we be past this? No, we shouldn't. You have to make the case all the time. Sorry, I'm not directing that at you. I'm directing it at someone I had to sit on a panel with last week. Sorry. It's wrong.
They shall always remain with us, our panel components. Any thoughts on that? Sure.
I'm going to affirm then, defer to our resident expert on Judaism in the early republic.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's a great book which actually engages in the very question that you should read. Do you know this book?
Which book is this? Is this Promised Land? It's Promised. Yeah, it's great. It makes a good gift as well.
Makes a great gift, Christmas gift, whatever.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, no, but I think one of the things that I learned from the book is the way in which Jewish Americans of the time sometimes sided with the Federalists and then sometimes sided with the Jeffersonians, and that where they stood politically also reflected, probably understood where their interests were.
Yeah. But that also, it struck me that there was a real fondness between the Jewish Patriots and the founders, between Washington, with Jefferson.
But maybe not Adams.
Yeah.
Not Adams,
Yeah.
but you can say that about, just in general, to the founders, you say this about the founders, but not Adams. I can say that to Jefferson's. By the way, let's play a quick game. What was the first U.S. state to elect a practicing Jew as its governor? Anybody know this? Utah.
Yep.
Second state? Idaho.
Fascinating.
Does Alabama have a Jewish congressman first, or does New York? Alabama. My point being, the way politics are arranged in this day at this era is not a function of how they have always been.
Mm-hmm.
And we forget that at our peril. It just makes me happy thinking about it. There was a Jewish governor in Salt Lake City who said he loved being in Utah because it was the only place he could be a Gentile.
So it's LDS joke.
They cut there for Mormon.
But we have robust Mormon studies here at UVA. I don't know if anybody's in the room, but we really do. Yes, the gentleman here, and then I think I saw someone back there as well. Right here in suit.
Hi. Sorry, I'm a little bit croaky. I'm fighting off a cold. I have a question primarily for Jerome, mostly because, one, we know each other, two, I've read your book. But it's for both panelists. But I was thinking, when I was reading, Jerome, your book, I was really, really struck by the last two chapters and the contrast between, the evangelical movement in the 1970s and 1980s and sort of contemporary post-liberalism and national conservatism. And I want to bring up a point which maybe this was raised when I was out in the hallway hacking because I recovered from my cold, but denominations, because the national conservatives, the post-liberals, Deneen, Hazony, Adrian Vermeule, none of them are Protestants, or very, very few of them are. Hazony is obviously Jewish. Deneen is Catholic. Vermeule is, I believe, a Catholic convert. So, Dreyer is now, who you mentioned earlier, is now an Orthodox convert from Catholicism, which was he converted to Catholicism from, I believe, evangelical Christianity. So, how does this transform sort of confessional landscape among these sort of, for want of a better term, reactionary intellectuals sort of inform their views of the American religious mapping?
Yeah, so the denominational story is really itself extraordinarily complex. And one of the things that I show in the book is, even if you look at a group like the Reformed Presbyterians, who are part of the larger Presbyterian community, but differed from most American Presbyterians in their rejection of the government. Within 20 years, even within that denomination, there's a split between those who are like, it's kind of good enough, and we can maybe play ball here, and the hardliners, right? So they undergo a schism, and then the schism undergoes a schism. So there's always given the, our constitutional structure of religious liberty, we have a lot of religion that happens both within denominations, denominations breaking apart, denominations coming together to work to a particular end. This idea of co-belligerency, which became really powerful in the 70s under the influence of Francis Schaeffer. Like, evangelicals can work with Catholics against abortion and gay rights, that sort of thing. So there's that story, and I don't think that story's new. The story of Hazony is interesting. I'll just make a quick point. He's a religious Jew who grew up in America. He lives in Jerusalem. He's the impresario of the National Conservative Movement, which is a kind of nationalist international. But he would say that he would align himself with a kind of Anglo-Protestant American nationalist. He thinks America ought to be an Anglo-Protestant state with public religion, where Jews would have religious liberty in their private lives, or I should say they would be tolerated as a religious minority, but they would not have religious liberty as Washington or Jefferson imagined it. And I think what the national conservatives are doing is really trying to articulate what a public Protestantism would look like in America. And Hegseth is, I think, part parcel of his project. So I think that sort of scattershot answers some of the questions we can discuss later. But I think one of the takeaways from my work is that denominations don't necessarily tell you a lot over time. They change. There's a lot of internal dissension based on not only doctrinal matters, but how they operate in a particular social or political context. And for an excellent book on this, there's a new book on American Christian attitudes towards abortion with reference to Roe v. Wade that just came out, Daniel Williams. And it's a fascinating account because he tracks how the issue of abortion, and particularly after Roe v. Wade comes down in 1973, is understood within the Catholic Church, within evangelical denominations, and within liberal Protestant or mainline Protestant denominations. And it kind of shows you these kinds of tensions and this fluidity.
Sir, did you still have a question? Yes, right back here, and then these two up here, I guess. Oh, right back there. Sorry, I wish I knew everyone's name.
Hi, thank you for a great presentation. When we talk about this church versus state, we seem to always slip into our sixth grade, that's the United States versus the church, right? But in 1783, it was 13 states, some of which had official religion, some of which didn't. And I think the thing we often miss is we talk so much about God and who's God best and all that. We miss that the religion was providing the social service net, social security net of the country at the time. And when the Constitution, and then followed immediately shortly there by the states, abolished state religion, that cut off tax revenue for serving social needs. And I've never encountered anyone who's really discussed this at depth in terms of how the country, I think we're still muddling through the transition that was never thought through.
Oh, you don't want to take that first? Okay, that's the. As you point out correctly, this is 13 different arrangements. So I will do my best to give a broad answer, and we can talk later about specifics. The churches are providing some social services, particularly poor relief, in some states. Some states have a more robust establishment. Some have almost none. What they are also doing, particularly in Virginia, Massachusetts, Connecticut, is requiring that a Congregationalist or Anglican, depending on where you are, has to perform your marriage. And that if you are preaching in public, you need to have a license. And these, as you might guess, it's not that they're not going to Sunday services every day and being like, any non-Anglicans in here? But if a Baptist starts talking and gives some lip, you can bet the authorities will be at their Baptist church the next day saying, do you have a license to preach? Or is this marriage solemnized in our church? Which is to say the churches are also part of providing a social safety net was making sure that people did and performed their religious obligations under the church as it was. So again, particularly in Virginia in 1786, 20 years later in Connecticut, even later in Massachusetts, the disestablishment of those state churches, does affect the idea of a social safety net. There is no idea of a social safety net, not really. Certainly not like we have, and then until the 1930s. But it also, again, this is not the decision was made that it is more important, okay, these are providing a certain social services, but the cost is you have to make a confessional statement, and you can't be married by someone of your choice.
I actually think I'm going to defer to a resident Catholic scholar here, because this is part of the story of Catholic institutions in America, and particularly the emergence and development of a kind of a Catholic counter institutions to the public schools, but also orphanages, hospitals, and what have you. because some of the secular services, like the public schools, were seen as maybe secular but de facto Protestant. Right. So there's a story that can be told not only of the Catholic Church, but also we could talk the story of the Mormon Church, the Jewish experience, and other minority religions who are taking that space, not with public money, not with government money, but with money and support from their own communities.
Yeah. Well, we're seeing this tension really arise in this current moment. The Catholic Church, I think, popularly, I think this is not, a fully, I think it's a bit of a caricature of the Catholic Church, but, the Catholics agree with the GOP on abortion, and therefore they're in lockstep on everything. But the tensions on migration right now are very real, and not just, Catholics in the pews or Catholics in, migrant serving organizations, but increasingly with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, for whom it is a matter of conscience to serve migrants. We haven't talked at all about the kind of the way that Catholicism as an immigrant religion kind of plays into some of the emergence of anti-Catholic sentiment at various points in the history of the church. But yes, to your earlier point, there's so much here that we could have an entirely different, separate conversation about these points of synergy, but real tensions when we're talking about these public spaces. I haven't seen the sign, but one time for one more question. Yes, Father.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I found it really interesting to learn about the history of these Jewish figures and groups in advocating for religious diversity and religious liberty in the United States. I'm curious about where the terminology and concept of a shared Judeo-Christian heritage comes from as a way of kind of, all of a sudden now that term is being used to kind of argue against religious liberty. We have this shared heritage that we need to protect against these other types of groups. And so where does that concept arise? Did you talk about, I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but is that something that comes up or?
I didn't, but 1954,
So this is the idea of the Judeo-Christian really begins to emerge in the late 30s and 40s as a response to fascism. It's the term's it's around before. There's a wonderful book, The Invention of Judeo-Christian America, came out a few years ago. There's also some work by Mark Silk, who's written some articles about this. So initially, it is about acknowledging the religious diversity, but kind of unified religious diversity. And by the way, Judeo-Christian Catholics didn't really like to use the term, right? It was really kind of, Jews really liked to use this term, Protestants did, but Catholics didn't. And it really comes into prominence in the 40s and 50s, right? So when the new text of the Pledge of Allegiance is circulating, and the Eisenhower administration is behind it, and preachers are getting up for giving sermons about why this is important. It's the Judeo-Christian foundation of America, not the Protestant foundation. So that already that tracks, right? That it shows this broadening of the sacred canopy. By the 60s and the 70s, it begins to fall into a little bit of disrepute because it's gone from being something that's expanding to something that's really contracting. By the late 70s and 80s, it's taken on by the religious right, the moral majoritarians, as meaning something much more specific, particularly the stream of moral issues that were being endorsed by Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and the like. So today, it's sometimes heard as a kind of a reactionary slogan. What's interesting again today is that there are those, particularly among some of the conservative Protestants I mentioned earlier, who don't like the term because they think it's effacing Christian truth, right? That by saying Judeo-Christian, they are facing the particular and universal truth of Christian revelation. So the term itself has a very interesting history. It has a very interesting politics. And I think it was originally meant to be inclusive, but now it is heard as a more, and you hear this sometimes with terms like the Abrahamic tradition, right? That we started entering public discourse in the 80s and 90s as a way of acknowledging pluralism. But it's a way of acknowledging pluralism that effaces the particularity of the particular groups that are involved in that.
If I can just add, there's a great book called Try Faith America by someone whose name I currently forget, but just about the formation of this idea in the Second World War of the American tradition is mostly Protestantism, but also with Catholicism and Judaism. We're all working together. The story of the four pastors, or the two
Dorchester.
Yeah, the USS Dorchester goes down, and two Protestants, a Catholic priest and a Jewish rabbi, give up their life vests, and they all hold hands while the Dorchester goes down. And this is what America is supposed to be. I will also say that early in the U.S. Republic, that the Jews are not saying Judeo-Christianity, because this is, to me, this is the most wonderful thing I discovered. This is the first time since Rome that Jews can respond to Christianity on its own terms, because, of course, traditionally under Christian rule, Jews are not allowed to say anything disparaging about Christianity or criticizing the New Testament. And there is a real outpouring. A guy named Jacob Mordecai writes down a long sermon that he gives and gets handed around, and people publish things explaining, like, here's where I disagree. Here's why the New Testament is wrong. And I did check with the Baptist ministry. He makes a great point that I think a lot of Jews have wondered. If Christ is supposed to be called if the Savior is Emmanuel in the book of Isaiah, then why is he named Jesus in the New Testament? And I did check with one of my friends, a Baptist minister. He was like, yeah, I wondered about that myself. But this is the kind of thing that can happen, under conditions of, it is a sign of the way in which religious freedom has expanded, that these things can get written and talked about. Let me give you one more. So I just
you gotta hurry. I gotta go to class.
All right, one more. Will Herberg's Protestant Catholic Jew comes out in the mid-50s is essentially the classic text on this. It's purportedly a sociology of American religion. It's wrong in many of its details. It's very interesting and important as a historical document.
Great. Well, thank you so much. First of all, to all of you for your wonderful questions, and thank you to Adam and Jerome. What a great conversation. I would like to remind everyone that both of their outstanding books are for sale in the hallway, so I encourage you to purchase one or to find a way to read these. They are or two or three. They're so illuminative, and thank you again for your attendance. Have a great day.